17th, 1981, in Grandpa and Grandma's house on Rosewood Lane in Salt Lake City.
Wild Rose
Wild Rose Lane. Oh.
That's Dad telling us about when he was a little boy and his dog. You'd have to talk louder, he'll never hear you.
I'll sit over here. All the time you're talking, you look at me if you can stand it.
Sure, I can stand it.
The Bible says to tell us about your dog when you were a little boy.
Tell about my dog?
Yeah.
Well, I had a nice little dog that I could train to do circus tricks after I'd watched one up in sort of a circus that come through town. They had this little dog climb up a ladder and then jump off. So I went home and built a ladder up into the loft of the old barn down there, and pretty soon I got the dog to crawl up and jump off onto the hay inside the barn. And then finally I turned it around and had him jump down on a sort of a bunch of straw and stuff that I had there for him to jump off. You could train him to do almost anything if you take the patience and the time to do it. A little black and white one, he's...
As I was driving down here, I was wondering when you could remember the first automobile that you ever saw. When was that?
I don't like to remember it because it gives me such a bad time. First one I watched was one that belonged to Henry Hayball in Logan. And it was one of the first ones that come into Cache County, one of those big tall ones that had big wheels and it didn't have any top on it. It just had a place where they sit up in there. And all the people had on these here old dusters and hats with tied on with the big, what do you call them, scarves or whatever to hold their hats on. And Dad and I just been over to Logan and took a bunch of turkeys and geese and ducks over there just for Thanksgiving time. We was coming back down by the old oil well, or by the old watering trough rather, on the Benton Ward Road. And here come this thing up the road, this automobile, and they was yelling and hollering, and everybody did when they had one of these fancy cars. And our old horse was scared to death of him, so Dad pulled it off the side of the road, and I got out and held onto the horse's head, tried to get out of the road of the thing. We got along pretty good until they got right beside us, then they gave a great big honk on that old horn, and went, honk! And the horse laid down on the shafts and broke them off, and I had to walk home holding up one side of the shaft. So from out in Benton Ward, that was about a 10-mile walk. I got home, I guess, about 11 or 12 o'clock at night. Now that's my first recollection.
What year was that?
What year was that been? It was before 1907. I don't know whether it was 1905 or 1906.
You were very old then.
6 years old?
Oh, Dad, you couldn't have done it. You, a 5-year-old boy could never have held those shafts.
Listen, it was done before I moved to Newton. I moved to Newton when I was 7.
In those days you had to learn early.
No. No, this is, you can verify this when you talk to my mother up above.
Yeah, when I get there.
But that's the fact, because I can remember it very well.
You can't even remember back that far.
Till I was 7 years old?
No, sir,
I can remember when I was 3.5 years old.
Because
When Hazen was born, just as plain as if it was yesterday.
I always said the Coolies used to like to argue. Mother, when can you remember?
I was trying to think what I can remember farthest back. I can remember, I can't remember farther back than when I was 6 years old.
You remember the...
And I wanted to go to school so bad. My folks, I wasn't well. I had what they call St. Vitus dance, which is a nervous disease. And they wouldn't let me go to school when I was 6 years old. And we went to Logan the day school opened up because they knew I wanted to go so bad. And when we come home, the kids were just getting out of school. And I felt so bad to think I couldn't go to school that year. And I didn't get to start till I was 7 years old.
When did you first meet Dad?
Oh, I can't remember when I didn't know Dad. He was older than me a little bit.
You went to school together all your life?
Well, we were in the same town and we went in the same schoolhouse. And he went to the same church, and as far as I can remember, I can't remember when didn't know him. He was always there.
When did you first date?
Oh. He took me home from a picture show one night.
He
It was
didn't
the first
take you?
time. No. No, I don't believe it was a picture show. Was it a picture show or? I don't know whether it was a picture show or some other kind of a entertainment or something. There was 2 or 3 of us walked home, Eva and I guess it's Eva. But he stopped at my place. And Eva went on.
Where did they live then?
Well, they lived just through the block, north of our place, the block across the road and up on the corner, through the block. It meant she had a block and a half to go by herself.
To the north?
North.
Did you always live out west of the...
I always lived, I was born in that home.
How old was you when you can remember the building, the basement and where?
Well, yes, I can remember back when the home that they built for Aunt Annie and Uncle Mark built.
The place where we raised all our family.
Yes, where our children were raised primarily. They were digging a basement. They tell me I was only about 5 years old, my mother said. And I can still see that they were excavating the basement, and they used to have 2 horses hitched to a scraper that scraped out the dirt. And they had like a little roadway where they'd back down in, and then they'd scrape it on up and take it out. And the horses fell as they was backing down that roadway. They fell, and I was scared, of course. And I stood and screamed and screamed and screamed because those horses lay down kicking, and they was tangled up in their harness and that. And I can still see that horse laying down there, and the other horse trying to pull away from it and kicking and screaming. And that's the very first memory I have. And they told me when I think of that home is that. And they told Mother that I was about 5 years old.
How soon did you start driving?
Well, I was only about 14 when Uncle Mart had a little Model T Ford pickup. And he came home one day from a Saturday afternoon, and I was to Aunt Annie's. We spent a lot of time to Aunt Annie's place. They had no children of their own, and we kids were just like part of their family. We had like 2 sets of parents almost. And Uncle Mark came and said, "Well, would you like to drive this?" To me, and I says, "Uh-huh." So he got me in and showed me how all you had to do was push on the clutch to push it in and pull it, and it started. That was the low, and all you had to do was slip your foot off of it and it flipped into high. And then when you wanted to stop, you put it down halfway and it was a neutral. And you put your foot on the brakes and the car stopped. And I drove it all around town. And it ended up at the confectionery.
You were inside the confectionery?
No, in front of the confectionery, and all the kids in town was there wanting me to give them a ride. So,
That was your driver's training then, huh?
that was my driver's training.
Was
Good.
the confectionery just a store?
Well, it was an ice cream parlor.
Where was
They
it?
sold right across the street from the schoolhouse, a little bit south. How far would it be, Dad? South of the,
Almost straight across.
almost straight across.
From where the
But they had
store is now? Where
They
the
had
post
a
office is?
serving area, and then they had a place where people could
It's,
sit at tables all the
It's
way
where
around.
where Terry Griffin has his home, just north of where his present new home is. It's in an old, well, there was the old home, and then north of that was a barber shop.
Barkers lived across the street from the school.
Yes, well, this was Will Barker's that lived the other south. And
They later moved that store up on the corner.
yeah, they moved the store up onto the corner, but that store originally started right down
Do you remember it being there?
I was trying to think. It
East of the
So it
schoolhouse.
was there. I seem as though I can remember when they moved it to the corner, but I
That's
don't.
what I was thinking.
Now, that is possible, because it was over there for years. That was the first, it was just a confectionery, then they gradually made it into a store.
That's where I used to spend all my money to go to court my wife. Go out and get a box of candy and then she'd see me.
Oh, yeah, I know. There was never a time I didn't want to see it.
I go work for her dad, pitch hay all day for $2, and then when they pay me, well, then I'd cash the check and spend it for candy to get to see my wife.
About the same as the young kids today. The dog you were telling us about, is that the one that Grandma Cooley, great Grandma Cooley set the leg on it when it broke its leg?
Your grandma set the leg on the dog when it broke its leg.
Oh, well, that was that same little dog. The same little dog I was telling them about that I could train to do almost anything. Driving the cows up to the north of the place there. A crazy guy that lived up that way on a horse, and he run over the little dog and broke. I carried it home, and when I got home, why, one back leg was dangling, one front leg was broken, and Dad had said I'd have to kill it. And of course that was against any ideas that I ever had. And I was going to kill a pup dog. And so Grandma come out and she says, or I went up there, I don't remember now which, but she said, I know I can set that dog's leg. I set many a lamb's legs. And so she wrapped it all up and put a couple of splints on the back leg and another little splint and some wrapping on the front leg, and the dog laid around for a day or two, and then he tried his best to pull off the bandage, which is natural for all animals. They don't like it on there. And I kept watch of him and tied it up with string and everything. Pretty soon he got up and started walking on it. We had him for years after. Yeah, quite a thing.
I was wondering if you could tell us when Grandpa first got, so he couldn't walk, your dad got, so the rheumatism, so he couldn't walk. How do you remember him when he could walk? Or?
I could never remember my dad when he wasn't impaired with arthritis, and I can remember him when he could get up in a buggy and drive this buggy around. That was, well, one had a shaft and one horse to pull it, and a little buggy. He could get up in the buggy.
Harnessed the horse, did she?
Yeah, he could help to harness the horse. I helped along with it. But that was after, well, we moved to Newton. I can't remember much about him riding or doing anything particular except going fishing. And when we lived down in Aldo, that was before we moved up there, before I was 7 years old, I can remember going down to the river, sitting on the riverbank down there and fishing with him. I can remember him going in this buggy in the spring and going down when the Bear River used to overflow its banks, and they didn't have any dam down there, so it was way low in the summer, but it overflowed its banks in the spring. And we had a meadow down there, and it would, water would come up in there about 2 feet deep, and these old carp would come out there to spawn. And they was about, from 20 to 30 pound carp. And they'd come out there to spawn out there, and then Dad would get down there with his gun and shoot these carp. And I had a special fork built that he could jab down and pick them up and put them in the back of this buggy and take them home, and then we used to hang them up in the chicken coops for the chickens to eat. But great big carp. And they'd swim around, just looked like a herd of pigs down in there, swimming around.
Was it your brother that got drowned down in Bear River?
No,
Or was that
it's my mother's brother.
or your mother's brother?
Yeah, my mother's brother that was drowned down there. That was years before I was even thought about.
Grant Larson sent me up a tape of that
I beg pardon?
Grant Larson sent us a tape, a recording of some
What?
Christensen that told about that drowning.
Yeah, there was a Christensen boy and my uncle, Alphine, he was only 8 years old. This other boy was only about 8, 9 years old. They went to swimming over there by Smithfield and in the river there, and when they, all of a sudden, they couldn't find Alphine anywhere. The other boy they found in about a day, but they both drowned at the same time.
According to this Christensen, he said that they weren't swimming, but they were trying to ford across the river, and they were taking a stick and poking it in ahead of them so they could wade across the river, is when he disappeared.
Well, I guess that's anybody's guess because nobody was there, only these two kids, so.
He said he was there.
And he was 5 years old, he said.
Oh,
Mother, I wanted to ask you that today to tell us a little bit about when Marble was born.
Well, she was
Where was she
born,
born, in which hospital, and how many doctors did she have in attendance?
she wasn't
Yeah.
born in a hospital.
she was
She was
born.
born in my mother's and dad's home. And we had one doctor, of course, there. Dr. Hayward came. And let's see, but he wasn't the doctor that was supposed to come. It's funny, when Ralph was born, Dr. Hayward was supposed to be our doctor. And he brought twins to a cousin of ours over in Malga that same day. So he said I had another doctor coming who was to take his calls. And so he delivered Ralph. And then when,
Was that J.C.?
no, the JW.
Yeah, J.W. was the doctor, but J.C. was the one that come.
No, it was Budge. When Wallace Budge. And so I thought, well, if Dr. Hayward isn't going to be there to bring the babies, when I found out I was going to have another baby, I went to see Wallace Budge, I had went there after Marble was born, or after Ralph was born, so I thought I'd just as well go to him. So I went to him all the time before Marble was born. Well, he was on vacation when Marble was born. So we got Dr. J.W. to come, and he delivered Marble.
What happened with the rest of them down the line?
Well, then, and he also delivered, Dr. J.W. delivered John. And then he decided to go east and specialize. And it wasn't to be in obstetrics, it was something else that he specialized in. I can't remember what.
Medicine, internal
Some kind
medicine.
internal medicine or something. And so he said we all would have to take someone else, and so I decided we'd go to Dr. McGee. And he delivered, and had I known just what kind of a doctor Dr. McGee was, he would have delivered every one of my babies, because he was a baby doctor and a maternity doctor. He knew what he was doing.
Did he deliver any more
He
of them?
delivered all the rest of my babies.
And where were they all born? So that we can let
Well,
Audrey and the rest of them know.
let's see now.
Mary?
John was also delivered.
Cooley. Pretty good. Can you call back just a little bit?
No.
Where was I anyhow?
Down to John.
No, John. Yes, John was born on a Sunday. The first baby I had born on Sunday. I can't remember just which days the other. Ralph was born, I believe, Thursday, but I can't
I
remember.
can tell you about John. I was on the state board in Hiram, and I was over there to a Sunday school state board meeting. When I got back to Logan, my mother said, "You're supposed to be in Newton. You're going to have a new son today." So we got this old Ford going, and every time I get it up to 30 miles an hour, it'd boil all over. So I had to get it down to 20 miles an hour. That mother was all about frantic, trying to get there in time.
But it,
Born out to Grandma Griffin's
yeah, he
too.
was born at Grandma Griffin's home too. And when he was born, he was a great big strapping boy. He weighed 9.5 pounds. He was the biggest baby I had. And
Were any of them born in hospitals?
yes, my last two.
Mary was born out there too.
No, Mary was born up in our own home in
Well, I said,
Newton. Mary was born in Newton.
The same doctor delivered home in Rooster?
Dr. McGee delivered Mary. Dr. J.W. delivered, Hayward delivered John. And then Mary, Dr. McGee brought Mary and
Bob.
and Audrey and Bob and Noel and Ruth.
Well, since Marvel and Mary are here tonight, why don't you tell about a little bit about the early life of them and let them do a little talking here instead of me doing all the
They
talking.
can probably remember their early life lots more than I can. Well, I guess I started growing up in the old home up the north end of town. You were 16 before we moved out to the big home, weren't you?
Mhm.
And
I remember we sure did a lot of crazy things.
well, every family does a lot of crazy things.
We used to like to go there and swim in the big ditch, as we called it, and I couldn't believe how little it was when I got grown up and went back and looked. 'Cause we thought it was just huge, really a big ditch. And what did it have, about a foot of water in it?
I guess it would be about a foot of water over in the big ditch. They said
Yeah.
how they used to go swimming in the big ditch.
oh,
Over the-
you mean over there
At the
by
head
Tom?
gate. Where the head gates
Oh.
were.
Where it went across those weirs, it would have been 2 feet deep in front of those weirs. About 1.5 to 2 feet deep in there. They generally have about a 2 foot stream of water coming in there, and they divide it up into 4 ditches, about a 1/2 foot in each ditch over this weirs. But and then there was one place up there that was they had a sand trap that could have been 4 feet deep, but I think that was full of sand most of the
Yeah,
time.
I think it was too. But what we used to do that was so crazy was we'd have somebody sit in the weir so
Yeah,
the water couldn't go down the ditch, and then we'd crawl in that ditch underneath the road.
good heavens.
And,
I'm sure I'd have had a nervous breakdown if I'd have known.
and then we'd sometimes have somebody sit on one side of it, and somebody'd go over and sit on the other side, and then you'd stand up and the water gush down and push you down the ditch a ways. I'm sure that farmers just loved it. Their water came in spurts when we were over there.
You only had water for 3 or 4 hours, you dabbed it off half the time. Those weirs, David, were a trapezoidal weir like this, so they could just sit down in it and walk it off. Yeah.
One of the things that I remember now, thinking how really terrible it must have been, and then we must have been in our later elementary years, because we had read about going to the seashore and playing in the sand. And so I can remember swimming on a hot day and then going into the deep dust along that road that went north of our house and just burying ourselves in that dirt. And of course it's not sand, it was mud. And I can just imagine how we must have looked. And we were old enough that it should have bothered us to be all covered with mud.
Where the mud baths originated, huh?
The dust was so deep along that road that was not surfaced.
Yes, I can
And
see
so
it.
soft. And
I don't think it even had gravel on it.
No,
it was
that
just
was
a soft,
soft.
powdery dirt.
It'd be down the soft part of the.
The one other memory I have that confuses me somewhat with my memories of Christmas, I know we never really got up early in the morning on Christmas. We would try. I can remember that how we would comment to one another that every night we could hardly whisper in bed that Dad wasn't calling up, "You children be quiet." And on Christmas Eve, we could shout down that chimney, or the pipe came up through the hole in the floor, and shout, and no one could hear us. Dad could never hear us. But we would always, of course, watch Uncle Roland's home to see when they lights would appear there out of that one window, and then we'd try to report to Mother and Dad. But I can't remember that we ever got up really early on Christmas morning, other than like probably 5:30 or 6 o'clock. But I remember one more Christmas morning where we went over into Uncle Tom's field, where there was a lot of ice, and I think we had a bicycle that year and some dolls and some skates. And I can remember it was like being out at midnight playing on that icy pond or field just to the northeast of our house there. And yet I can't believe that Christmas morning he would have let us over there very early.
Oh, yes, at least I was probably just as daylight was coming on.
It seems to me,
Yes,
my
I can
memory
remember
is
that here, and
really,
they-
really,
That must have
It
been Bill
had-
Rigby's land,
It was that old Rigby's land.
not Tom Griffin.
No, it was like Rigby's
well, it was
land.
just
North of
across the
Tom's.
street from Uncle Tom's.
North of his home.
And it overflowed it had overflowed and froze until it was a solid mat, and you kids, I think that was the year Ralph must have got skate shoes.
Skates, and we went over, and
And
some
the
of us
kids
didn't
didn't-
have skates. I don't think I'm sure I didn't have skates, but we would just go over
Take the slate maybe and
and run around and slide. But I can remember carrying my doll, and I think somebody else took the bike over and tried to ride a bike on the ice.
I remember one Christmas, you'd never let us get up and come down until you told us we could get up, and then we always had to get dressed. So I remember one Christmas that Ralph and I carefully laid everybody's clothes out the night before so we could find them in the dark. We got everybody out
and dressed.
and dressed them, and then we hollered and asked if we could get up, and you said no, it was too early. And we said, but everybody's dressed. And Dad always had to go in and get the fire going, so
it was too cold to let you.
I guess he went down and made the fire and let us come down. But I think most of the time we didn't really get up that early, because it seems like when we'd get up, we'd find out that everybody else was already up. You could see lights all over everywhere.
Everywhere in town, we felt we were always the
Last
latest
ones
one.
up.
Well, tell me about it, so I can get you on the movie.
I didn't want to be on this one. But I do remember doing that.
But I am glad that you had us all get up as a family, because I know most of our friends would get up one at a time, and I don't think they had the family fun that we had, opening gifts. They would each one at a time crawl out and see what they had. We never could do that. And that's a tradition I carried on into my home.
It's a tradition that my children are still carrying on
Yes.
today.
And
I know at Susan's they can't get up in their night clothes, and everybody has to get up and get dressed and go in together. And we have pictures of our kids on the stairway waiting to come down together.
I remember the year that Audrey, I guess she would be, what, a year and a half old? Mary, 3.5? They both got dolls for Christmas, and Mary, of course, was quite a lot nicer than Audrey's doll. And Audrey wouldn't have a thing to do with her doll. She wanted Mary's doll.
It felt like when Dorothy was only a year and a half old, because she was just from October till December, past a year. And David was in Hawaii, and I had fixed up an old doll, covered the body with some plastic cloth, and made it some new clothes, because dolls were so hard to buy. You couldn't buy a rubber doll
You
during the
couldn't
war.
find good dolls.
And you'd got Ruth a little, Santa Claus had brought Ruth a doll with a bride's outfit
Yeah, that was
on
her
it.
last doll.
And she had a stroller, and I think you'd gotten Dorothy a little wheelbarrow, and Dorothy would not have the wheelbarrow, and she wouldn't touch her doll. She pushed Ruth around all that week, and when we went home, Ruth let her have the stroller. But Ruth kept the doll. So they learned awfully young.
yes, indeed.
They can tell the difference between one that's a little bit more fancy than the other
The other
one.
one, even though they're only a year old.
Yeah.
Well, that's how Dorothy, and Mary was good. to Audrey. And the only time she took it was when Audrey was asleep or something. Then she'd take her doll and play with it. So she was real good to Audrey, because Audrey made such a fuss, I guess.
Tell us about preparation for our wedding, would you, Mother?
Yes, that was about as hectic a time as anyone could go through. When you decided to get married and came home and what did you announce to us Monday morning?
We're getting married Wednesday.
That you wanted to get married Wednesday. And so we said, well, we did the best we could, and we went over and scurried around and got, I think, a very pretty wedding dress. And got ready for the wedding, and what day, was you married on a Wednesday?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I guess you was married on a Wednesday then. And we thought about having it at home, but we kind of, Dad said, oh, let's have it over to Grandma Cooley's house so Grandpa could be there. And but it sure took a lot of hurrying and doing.
You spent
get
a lot
ready.
less hours worrying about her wedding than you did Mary's, I'll bet.
Well, yes, like this. And we didn't have time to do anything else. But the worst part of it was, a couple days later, I broke out from head to heels with hives. And I went over to see Dr. Hayward, he had specialized in skin specialist. Or, well, he might have been internal medicine too, but anyway, when he saw me, he said, what in the world have you been doing? What have you been eating? And I couldn't think of a thing I'd been eating that was different than I'd been eating at all. And he said, well, have you had anything different happen to your family? And I said, well, Marvel came home last Monday and said she wanted to get married on Wednesday. And I said, so we hurried up and she did get married on Wednesday. And he says, good heavens, who did she marry? One of these fly-by-nighters from Chicago? That was when the Army was stationed up at Utah State. And
I said,
there were
yes,
some of the
you married
girls.
an Army man.
Yeah, some of these girls were married, and these boys, and I said, no, this is the boy her brother's best friend that she's known from Trenton, and he says, well, that's all right. It's fine if she married one of our kind of people. He says, that's what's caused your hives, all right.
That's enough to have anybody hives.
He said, that was enough to give anybody hives, but there's nothing you can do about it. You'll be all right.
What do you remember about Mary's wedding?
Carrying the cake
Carry
home.
the cake home. See Mary cut it.
It was like Jeanette. With a beautiful cake.
Well, our sugar was all rationed, and raisins and things were hard to come by. They were expensive, and you couldn't get them because of the war. And I did have sugar or raisins and things on hand, and I had sugar, stamps. Whatever it was, ration stamps we had to have.
Well, I growed sugar beets, and there you could get
people could
an
get
additional amount of sugar.
What year were you married, Mary?
1947.
And so I'd heard this woman over in Trenton made such beautiful wedding cakes. Nobody ever told me what kind of wedding cakes they were, only they were beautiful. And it was a beautiful cake.
But they were plaster of Paris?
No one had ever told me that. But someone told me what a pretty wedding cake, and there wasn't anybody in Newton that I made any. So I ordered it over there, and I furnished all the stamps, and I got the sugar. I got the sugar and furnished the sugar, and I furnished these raisins and whatever else was she needed to put in it. And then I paid her $20 which I thought was an outlandish price at that time for a cake.
Which it was.
Yes, it was a lot. And then it was a beautiful cake. My bar went with me to bring it home. this was after they were married, the day after they were married. I think the day they were married, but the reception was to be that night. And we got home, and I guess it was the same day, wasn't it, Mary? That we got the
Must have
cake?
been the day before.
Maybe it was the day before, but anyhow, LeVar went up and he drove the car. And I drove the car and he sat and held
It could have been that day.
and he sat and held the wedding cake like this on his hands, so that it, on a glass,
So it wouldn't fall
fancy
apart.
glass plates, you know, that holds it, so that it wouldn't break, and all those other fancy things that was on the wedding cake wouldn't fall off. And it was a beautiful cake till we went to cut it. And I think you saw the picture that we got of the cake, knife bending when Mary tried to cut the cake.
What do you remember about your wedding cake?
I don't think I even had one.
We didn't have any.
No.
Mother, why don't you tell us about the earliest things you can remember about your parents? Tell us a little bit about them.
Well, I guess if I can't remember, no one else can. It's my dad died quite young. Dad was only 60 years old when he died. And Mother lived to be 79.
You said he was how old when he
nearly
died?
60.
60.
Mm-hmm. And Mother lived to be nearly 79. And so she had quite a number of years being alone. And I remember them more, I guess, well, of course I remember her all my life. At home, she was always very good. She was an expert at sewing. She knew how to do any kind of sewing, that anything she could do with her hands, any kind of needlework, Mother was really good at. And she did teach me how to knit and to crochet, which I'm very glad she did, because I never would have learned otherwise. It was World War I when she was, I think she was head of the Red Cross in Newton, and she was had a bunch of scarves. They knit scarves to put around the soldiers' necks, I guess when they were in the trenches in Europe. And she said, well, you just as well learn how to knit. You could just as well make one of these straight scarves. All you do is knit. And she got them the needles, and of course the Red Cross furnished the yarn, and I made a scarf. That was the first knitting I'd ever done. And she taught me how to knit. But that's all it took, was learning how to handle the needles. Anybody can.
I'll turn it off.
Dad really was an outstanding man. For one thing, for a number of years, I guess he was the most highly educated man in Newton, which of course, I guess, among educators, they wouldn't amount to much. Newton was a very small town. But I guess he was the only person that had a college degree. He graduated from the University of Utah. And he intended to go back and get a law degree. He was going to become a lawyer, so my mother told me. But he didn't have any money, and he decided to teach school for a year. And in the meantime, he started going with my mother, and they decided to get married. And they had only been married a month when he left for the mission field and went to Virginia. It was called the Southern States, but he spent his whole mission in the state of Virginia. And he spent 3 years there. And he became, right at the last, he was secretary of the mission. I think that's what it was. And I gathered that from his journals. I've read these journals through that he wrote. He kept a journal for his whole missions. They've got about five of them, I think, here, of his missionary journals. And he worked in the church all his life. He came home and he was president of or superintendent of the Sunday schools in Newton. Then he was soon called to work in the state MIA, and Stanley was just a baby, and I was about 2.5, 3 years old, and he was called on another mission, a mutual mission they called it, and sent to Bighorn in Wyoming. I think that was only a 6-month or 9-month or something mission, but anyway, he took him away from his family. And I remember Mother saying that they'd ask Stanley where Daddy was, and he'd say, Daddy gone to Bighorn on the tutu. So he was just big enough to talk. And then he kept on, he first then started working in the stake MIA. Then he was on the stake high council, and he finally ended up with being on the stake presidency in the Benton stake, where we all belonged to the Benton. It was then the Benton stake with the headquarters in Richmond, Utah. And of course that has since been changed, and it's been called the Richmond stake. And many of the wards have been changed out of it and divided again. But Dad only lived to be 60 years of age. He died with the brain tumor, and they don't know what caused it, but we kind of ourselves suspicioned that it was an accident. And Dad had I had a team of horses run away with him on a plow, and so he had quite a head injury a few years before when he was working, because he was a farmer all his life.
Tell me about his Utah State.
Oh, and yes, the last few years of his life, he was called to be a trustee at Utah State. And he was a trustee at the time of his death at Utah State. And he was considered a very well thought of man. His ideas were sought after, and people appreciated the things he thought of doing, and he was considered a very good speaker. He spoke at funerals all over that northern part of Cache County. People that knew him, he done lots of speaking at funerals, and he was asked to go down and give the principal speaker at that time. I think it was still the Branch Agricultural College in Cedar City. It has since been made the College of Southern Utah. And that was about the last thing he'd done that was outstanding. He wasn't too well at the time because Mother didn't feel like he was well enough to drive down, and Mina had to go with him and do the driving.
Was he also born and raised in Newton?
He was born and raised in Newton.
He was on the Cache County Board of Trustees before consolidation started, and was instrumental in consolidating the school systems, and instead of being separate districts for every little community.
Yes, he helped in the state of Utah.
Wasn't he quite active in the legislature too?
He never was. He ran for the legislature, but he didn't. His cousin Will Griffin went for the Republicans, and the Republicans were successful that year. Mostly they were in Cache County.
He was also a very ardent fan of athletics.
Yes.
All the time that he was on the Board of Trustees at Utah State, we had tickets for Utah State and the University of Utah both down here to go to.
Yeah,
And he was there. Remember, was the snow a foot deep or what?
That's interesting.
I didn't know that.
I wouldn't have thought it.
Yes, Dad liked sports. I guess my boys can actually buy it with the dad they've got.
I remember the pansies that Grandpa grew.
Yes, he grew. Grandpa had certainly had a green thumb.
Beautiful flower beds he had.
Grandpa was an exceptionally good gardener, and he had like trees and bushes.
He took after his mother in the gardening business.
Yes, I don't think my grandfather ever turned a shovel over as far as garden was concerned. I guess he could irrigate the Lucerne field, but I don't think he'd know a thing about a garden. But my grandmother had the loveliest little raspberry patch and strawberry patch.
Did he teach school most of the time then? You said he taught school.
He only taught school 1 year.
That was up in Clarksville.
And then he went on a mission, was gone 3 years, and come home and decided to be a farmer.
Oh, He did learn how
And
to
he
do it
loved
then.
he loved farming. And mother has some cousins that quite like Dad, and they said, but Johnny gets more out of a farm than any of us knows anything about. He knows what's in that handful of dirt that he picks up and looks at. But so maybe he did. He learned how to grow, and he was interested in getting better types of seed wheat, and he would travel off to get certain kinds of seed wheat to plant to make better crops in Cache Valley, better kinds of that would grow in Cache Valley. And
What do you remember about your dad?
Well,
before he
main
got
thing
become
that I
an
could
invalid.
remember about my dad was the fact that he was an ardent reader and kept up to date on current events of every kind. There wasn't anybody could come to our place and talk about anything in current events that he didn't know all about it. He was an ardent Democrat. Nobody else was any good. But I don't know other than that. He was one thing that I guess I learned more from Dad than anything else was the fact that he was determined that everything should be in its place and everything should be kept up to date. The harnesses had to be fixed when they was broke. They would not be due to go like some of them did with a rope tug or a wire tug or something to pull the things. They had to, if you broke a tug, you stopped and fixed it after that day. You might get by for that day, but it wasn't to go on and stay on. And machinery had to be put into shape. It wasn't to be run when it was a clattering and clunking along wouldn't go. And I think that that he was quite an individual as far as doing things or getting things done. We had an incubator, we had a brooder and raised chickens that way, one of the first ones in Newton that didn't set hens to do it. And we'd get 100 eggs and put in the incubator, and he got high-class roosters to put to the hens to improve the chickens and things like this that he kept up on. And of course, always wanted to see that we had a year's supply ahead in everything that we had in the food line. Always had plenty of meat ahead of time. That is the kind that we could have at that time, which was primarily pork, cured pork. We didn't have any refrigeration to keep any meat other than that, but we did. They used to kill a beef once in a while and divide it up and have a part of it, but most of it was chicken and pork. And he had a smokehouse. We had to fire with a certain kind of apple wood. Not any old wood would do. It had to be apple wood to smoke these hams. And they were really good. There's no question
They sure
about that.
tasted better than the ham.
My mother was
That was a kid tasting it again.
It was like her mother was an ardent seamstress. Sewed for everybody in the family, even for our kids when they was little. So,
Even our children.
Twilder, of course, in her last years, so on Afghans. But my dad had the first time I'd ever seen anybody die was my dad. And he died practically in my arms. But that's the first time I'd ever witnessed anybody die. But he just, head dropped down and he was gone. That was all there was to it.
How old was he then?
82 years old. He died on his 82nd birthday, August the 4th, 1954.
Seems like with Grandma, the thing I remember, as I think back, is how much she could get done in a day. I know as a little girl when I used to go there and stay that she'd get up in the morning, she took boarders, and she'd get up in the morning and do her washing before she fixed breakfast. And she'd have breakfast on the table, I imagine, by 6:30. And that was a big breakfast. It wasn't just an egg and a piece of toast. They ate, I remember her fixing cereal one thing I remember that she had a lot, or had often, was she'd have melted cheese on bread for breakfast. And I'm sure she had, you know, eggs and pancakes and bacon and things like this. And then she'd hurry up and wash all the dishes, and as soon as all the boarders would get out of to go to school, then she'd go upstairs and make the beds and straighten up the rooms upstairs and sweep them and whatnot, whatever they had to have done. And then she'd go back down and finish cleaning the house. And she had to go downtown. She walked so fast I'd always have to run to keep up with her. And she'd go downtown and back, and she never used a car ever. I
Didn't
guess
have
once
one.
in a while when Dad would come over, he'd take her places, but she had to walk all the time. And in the summertime, I remember she was always up early, 6 o'clock in the morning, out watering the lawn and getting that done. But she surely did get a lot of things done all the time. She was a fast worker and hard worker.
Well, she was a disciplinarian in the home. That I can't remember after I was a little shaver. I remember once he disciplined me. I'd done something that wasn't right around the house, and he grabbed a hold of my hair up here and pulled about an inch out of my hair. But that was the only time I could ever remember him ever doing much. Mother done the discipline. How she done it, I don't know. That's quite unusual to have a woman that could discipline her sons. She could. She just seemed like she'd talk to us, and that was all that was necessary. I could get into tears pretty easy if I'd done something wrong, or she'd talk to me. But the other thing that Marv was talking about, her doing all this cooking, she used to also iron and wash and iron their shirts for 5 cents a piece for these boarders.
I remember she would heat the iron on the coal stove.
Yeah.
And it weighed, I couldn't lift it as a little girl. But I also wonder, in both of your families, it's quite remarkable that they stressed education so much.
I didn't.
I say it's remarkable in that day that both your parents and Mother's parents stressed education for their children, because not all of your peers went on to school, and particularly someone in your situation where the father was not employed and could not.
That was their, Dad and Mother, both their ideals was that all of us kids had to get a college education. They said they didn't have any other way of leaving us with anything that was worthwhile as far as finance was concerned. But they could leave us with an education, and that's the reason she got up and moved to Logan and on that Amazon building, took those kids in there. When we were first married, she had 6 boys and 4 girls there one winter. The next year she had 6 boys there, and then she used to cook for the BYU basketball team, always before a game. Had to have toast and tomato soup or an egg or something like that. Always. All the families come over there to eat. And of course, the Dad was the center of the family organization there for years. If they ever had a family reunion or anything, it was always there.
Yes, and I think that speaks well for his brothers and sisters, that they would come to his home.
And not only that, but of course the thing that, I guess I shouldn't say this, but one member of the family thought they imposed on Mother because they always come there to eat, but they never brought anything to eat.
Well, that could have been too.
They didn't figure that Mother and Dad had enough to feed them, but she always did. And no matter if it was a party at night or whatever, sandwiches were always made. And they were always there at the place. They never had to worry about having something, refreshments after. Even after we was going together there in Newton, years before you remember anything about it over in Logan. But they used to come there to Dad's and Mother's. New Year's Eve, Christmas Eve or something, not Christmas Eve, but Christmas time, sometime during the holidays, but usually always on New Year's Eve. Always was there on New Year's Eve. But, and they had, we used to go to the dance and come back, they'd still be there. I'd be playing some of these crazy card games that didn't amount to nothing. And that was something I never seen one of them in all the time that I was ever around that ever got angry because they didn't win or because you played the wrong card or anything like that. When we was in a card club there, that is club, why some of those women couldn't stand it. If you played the wrong card, they just flared up like you'd made a major mistake in your life, you
Yeah,
know.
there was one or two that I do. And I never could keep track of the cards because I talked too much.
Well, I remember you and Uncle Roland, how you would get Aunt Alice and Mother upset because you would just keep bidding them up, and then drop them.
Yeah, they get a little upset, but they didn't get angry.
No, but they were always losing.
Well, that went on right down to Mount Pleasant. This Paul and Monson and I, we get there to bidding up on this rook. They'd all play rook. This Anderson, the seminary teacher, he couldn't take it when he lost either.
Oh, he was
He'd
terrible.
get angry about
He'd
it.
get angry. He got real upset. He wasn't really any fun to play with because he'd just got upset and almost lose his temper and that. And yet he was the seminary teacher. But Paul and Alda, nobody ever got upset.
Well, we do the same old tricks with him. You know you're supposed to bid if you can, but we just kind of wink at one another and smile and let them go along, you know. Got themselves a boat. couldn't have won any in a bet. They couldn't have won. Well, that was the only thing I thought was fun about playing cards. If you couldn't have a good time and play, then it wasn't worth it. No money or anything like that. It was just play for fun.
I know they used to have, when we'd have these club parties, I sure hated to get to be Leona Hawes's partner. She kept track of every card that was played, and she just got nasty if you played the wrong card. And I never was smart enough or something. I was dumb as far as cards was concerned. I never could see far enough ahead.
You do this and they do that.
If you do such and such, why somebody else should do such and such. I never was good. I never would have made a good bridge player nor anything.
Well, Roland could. He could keep.
Yeah.
He knew every card was played, and after he'd played about 2 rounds around, he'd know about everybody, what about everybody had. And he used to get this woman that she talks about so angry because he'd do the same with her. He'd do with her mother and with Alice. He'd just let her find herself in a hole, and then she'd get angry. But he was doing it just for fun. He didn't care whether he won or lost. It didn't make any difference to him. The prizes, my gosh, they used to think she was
I never
had to win a prize.
Won any prizes. I never won a prize ever on playing cards.
Well, that was what we had to do mostly for recreation. We didn't have too many other things. It was a long way to Logan to go to a show, and we didn't. Mortal and I never had a car. We had to go with Uncle Roland. He had a car most of the time. But other than that, well, we didn't have much.
Well, my dad had a Model T. That was the kind of car that he had. He got that when I was 15 years old.
Well, he finally had a Chevrolet. He graduated to the last
Yeah, he
car he had
graduated.
was a Chevrolet.
Yeah, he did go to his graduated to a Chevrolet. But
Your mother never learned to drive.
Mother never learned to drive. Mine and I had to do all the driving and chasing her around the county, around the state to relief or to primary meetings, because she was in the state primary. She was counselor in the state primary for quite a few years. And Aunt Florrie was the president. I don't know who the rest of the board was. I never took enough interest to know what they was doing. I just went along as a chauffeur.
She was also the ears and the chauffeur for Aunt Annie.
Yeah,
Come to Salt Lake, take her to the shows while Uncle Mort went to the meetings. And
well, from the time I was, I guess, big enough to walk almost, soon big enough to know anything, Aunt Annie but could not hear. She had lost her hearing, and she never had a hearing aid, and you could just shout at her, and she talked loud, and we all got used to it, and that, but she was nervous in the streets of Salt Lake, and she used to take, I come with her all the time until I was past 12 years old, because I could come ride for nothing on the trains for then. Uncle Marty had money, but he was a little bit tight with it. And he objected, I guess, but I guess Aunt Annie insisted on taking me. And then she was going to take Stanley next, but I don't know, Stanley never did come. I guess just didn't work out and so I don't know what they done for a little bit, but right after that, as Aunt Annie, she went to the World's Fair in 1915 in California. And I guess she had wanted to take me then, and Uncle Martin kicked up about that he couldn't afford to take me, because, of course, Dad never had enough money ahead of time to ever send to words like that. But anyway, Ida Rigby, that was George Rigby's, one of his daughters, married a California fellow, and they was going on their honeymoon. And so Uncle Mart said, well, they could go with them. Man, Annie said, afterwards I remember her saying, yeah, taking a honeymoon couple with you to help you go anywhere. She said, Uncle Mart would go off with his associates, people that he got knowing in this grain business that he knew, traveling around. And she said, she was alone. And she said, I wished 1,000 times I'd have taken Marvel with me, regardless of what Mart said. I heard her say that. So I'd have enjoyed the fair if I'd have had somebody with me that I could have. And I was 15 years old by then. You see, I'd have been old enough to really have helped her and that.
Mary?
But she didn't live long after that. Not so many years, a couple of years after that.
Is that thing still running? Good heavens.
Didn't I?
You better turn it off.
Turned on.
Can't even see it on and off.
Well, maybe you better not monkey with it.
Mm.
You'd hate to erase some of these.
Well, her dad was one of the first ones in Newton to have an experimental parcel of land in connection with Utah State, where they come over and grow all kinds of crops to see which ones would grow the best. I mean grains. What kind of grains would grow the best. And it was after one of those experiments that he sent down to Levan and got the first can red wheat to come into Newton. He shipped it up to Cash Junction. I remember going with him down to get it, 4 sacks of grain. With that, he improved the crops all over Newton, grain. For that, we had a kind of a mixed up grain of all kinds and descriptions, white and red and everything, just a general form mixture. But after that, he kept that pretty well straight, and he let everybody have a sack or two to start out a plant of their own so they could get their, upgrade their grain. And then after that, they got Turkey Red come in, and then several after that.
What was his degree in?
Well, it would have been something towards law. I don't know. Never did hear, but it was because he wanted to become a lawyer. He loved reading.
Especially Shakespeare.
He loved Shakespeare, and he could quote big passages of Shakespeare. I can remember hearing him quote Hamlet's, oh, what is it? To be or not to be, that is the question.
Oh, hi.
I can't think what else.
So he
But
used it
did.
in his talks almost
And he talked.
all the time. Never did talk without bringing something like that in.
And you know, I thought Dad always talked extemporaneously until I got this bunch of letters and stuff that we've got, you know, that he had. In that was, I guess, a booklet or books and things that Mother had kept, that Dad had written out talks, many talks that he had written out, just roughly what he wanted to give it, various things, and he had them just, so I guess he would think he didn't go unprepared to his talk. He talked all over the country to various things, and, I mean all over Cache County, but he didn't talk without knowing what he was going to talk about before he went.
But he never used any notes.
But he never had any notes when he got up. That's why I thought he was always talking extemporaneously, you know, just off the top of his head. But he always, evidently, because there was this paperback book that was right full of partially wrote speeches that Dad had, and it was in Dad's handwriting.
Did he talk,
Who's got those now?
I have.
did he talk fast like Uncle Stanley did when,
Not as fast as Stanley. He talked slower than Stanley, but just as emphatic as Stanley was.
I can't remember, I was 9 years old when he died, and so I don't remember hearing him talk. I probably did, but I just don't have a recollection of it in my mind. My memories of him are just as a grandpa out to his place, and that he used to come. I remember one thing him doing was coming and taking us to school in the sleigh in the wintertime when it was cold, and a few times, only a couple of times doing that, but I don't really remember him in church or things like this, and yet I probably had heard him.
Yes,
I remember sitting on his shoulders. I was, what, 5, I guess, when he passed away.
Somewhere's in there.
I don't know how old I would have been, but I remember riding on his shoulders. How he would give us a ride. I also remember being ill in their home one time and being given a drink of grape juice. I can just remember how much I enjoyed that, and lying on the kind of a day bed they had in their in that
little couch
room just off the kitchen, and both of them coming in, and he called me Dolly. I can recall that.
Yes, he called you Dolly. That was Mina's pet name for him, and then you inherited it. I don't know why he passed over Marvel and called you Dolly.
He called me Dolly as a
He called you
girl.
Because all maybe the little girls were called Dolly.
One thing, when we had a baby,
Yes.
we didn't have to worry about naming it.
Yeah, he'd come up.
He'd be there 1 week after the baby was
It's
born.
time we bless this baby now.
Did he change the name of somebody at the time of blessing?
No.
No. He always said, now, if you don't have a name, I've got one.
Yeah, he always had a name. And then he'd come out, he'd come up, I remember when Marvel was blessed, and he come and he said, well, it's time we bless the baby daughter. And I said, well, yes. And I said, I know what I want to name her. I want to name her Dorothy. And he says, no, I've got her name all picked out. And he picked her up and blessed her Marvel.
That's the story I was
Yeah. And the same when John was born, he come up and he said, now, time to bless the baby. You got a name?
Well, Aunt May had sent word up how, but that boy, she said, with a grandfather like he's got, he should be blessed after his grandfather.
Yeah, I know.
She
That's
said,
what
that boy should be named John Griffin, and she said,
so you see, we didn't have any trouble finding names for the kids. Already.
Lots of help.
and when Mary come, there was no one, we never chose Mary's name, and Grandpa said, this baby girl is to be named after her grandma Cooley.
Yep. Well, he's a great man, I'll tell you that. He's wonderful. And well thought of everywhere. But I guess when I first went to school, to college, or going to college, after we was married, I was going with him, and I don't know why. We were going to Logan, and something come up that I was beginning to doubt some of the things that was in the church, and I asked him, I said, Dad, do you think that everything that we say we believe in the church is absolutely truth? He said, if I didn't think so, I wouldn't tell you so. He says, I know it's true. I don't have any doubts. And it was about that time that I had 2 or 3 professors in the college that were planting a lot of doubts in my name, on my mind, I mean, about things in psychology and geology and the field of embryology and so on, all these kind of things. And so I was having a struggle. But after that I said I couldn't doubt anything about it after the way he gave it to me. And we were just alone, traveling along in the car. But I was thinking about how I had the inside track on my wife this afternoon. I was sitting here thinking. Joe Jones and I kind of teamed up in the summertime to go pitch hay for people. People in those days had to pitch it on the wagons, you know, from out of the piles and so on. And her dad thought we was pretty good because we could put a load of hay on about 1.5 tons on a wagon in about 15 to 20 minutes. Pretty easy, the 2 of us. And so he used to have 3 wagons, and he had a farm that was 2 blocks east of their place and about 1/2 mile, those 5, 6 blocks, I guess, south of there, about 30 acres that he rented. And he growed a lot of hay on this. Well, he'd send those 3 wagons, one after the other down there, and we'd send in 24 to 25 loads of hay in a day. And of course, we charged a little extra, Dr. Jones and I. Most people were getting $1.75 to $2 a day. We was charging 2.5, but he didn't ever seem to worry about that. So of course, I got to know her dad before I really knew her very much. Her mother and dad was really good cooks, or her mother was really a good cook, and I enjoyed eating there. But, do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember you.
Well,
we've used quite a few rolls of
Right.
3-minute film here tonight.
Well, I think you better quit.
I have to go home, I'll lose my happy husband.
Yeah, he will think you've,
Just a second. Go ahead and tell it.
okay. Well, I just saying, I was thinking about when you was asking if you knew anything about when you were married, and I was thinking about when I called up President Pond to ask him if he'd come down and marry you. And I was in the High Council at the time. He said, well, why don't they go to the temple? Why do they want me to marry him? Well, I said, there's a little bit of a difficulty there. David's not a member of the church. He isn't? He says, no. He says, I was sure he's a member of the church. I know his dad over there in Trenton was in the Scout movement all the time. I'm sure he's a member of the church. So that was kind of a surprise to a lot of people. And I remember the interview I had with you and asked you what your belief was regarding the church, and you said, well, you was willing to study it, And if you thought it was true, you'd join. If you didn't, you wouldn't. And of course, that was put up to me then to make a decision whether I'd allow my daughter to be married to a member outside of the church or not.
Remember what you said when we knocked at the door over at the
Oh.
Smithfield Junior High?
Yes, you can tell that. Come to the door and said, we want to get married. And I had a lot of excuses, but they didn't none of them work. Said the first place you can't get married in 3 days, you got to have a blood test for 3 days. We've already got it. I said, you got to get a license too after that. We already got it. Nothing to do.
It's kind of funny, I think I was sure that you wouldn't let me get married anyway.
Is that the only reason you said yes?
Well, I always admired Dave for saying that because he didn't make any rash promises that he was going to marry you just because I wanted him to be a member of the church.
I already believed it then, but I didn't tell you.
But I really believed it. That was great.
Well, I've seen so many girls marry fellows that wasn't worth the darn, that was members of the church. And I thought that Dave was such a fine fellow that I'd like to have seen you marry him, and I felt that he would eventually join it.
At least the family didn't turn the hose on me like they do one of our other boyfriends, huh?
Say, from what I remember going on in Marble life in high school, I think they were probably very grateful that it was David and not someone else.
Yeah.
I remember living in Ogden with Marble. She would confide in me, and I'd go home and Mother and Dad would confide in me, and I was really torn in my loyalties. Mostly I just listened.
She showed me the ring that this guy gave her.
Yeah.
So I
didn't
can
propose
remember.
then either.
No.
The funny thing about to me was that I wasn't aware that you'd been going together as long as you had. I thought you were just coming over to Ralph to study with him.
You should have asked Ralph. He knew all about it.
I never asked him. I didn't have any reason to. But anyway, it's been great.
But I'm telling you, you have certainly had one person that has stuck up for you, and that was Grandma Cooley. She thought you was fine. You've been there to her place enough times that she thought you'd make Marmal a fine husband.
And President Pond wasn't the only one that was fooled. I understood when you got back east, they asked you to talk in sacrament meeting before you were a member too. They didn't know you was a member of the church either.
I was asked to pass sacrament before I was a member too. I told him I didn't think it was right. They kept coaching me. I said, I thought you had a whole priesthood to pass sacrament.
Isn't that interesting?
They automatically assumed if you came to church,
You were from Utah.
Well, it's been a great family, and I tell you, we've been all really proud of him, and I guess he done more missionary work than any one of my family as far as getting members into the church. He got his own family into the church, and that was pretty good, I would say.
Yeah.